B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, 2/20/2020. There's the old slogan, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But last night, Elizabeth Warren showed up for a street fight with not just one switchblade, but several. And she proceeded to slash Mike Bloomberg and virtually everyone else on the stage. She showed a new level of feistiness. I think she proved to people who had doubts that she could go toe-to-toe with Donald Trump should she reverse her fortunes and become the nominee. Now, we'll get into more details about the debate in a moment. But late on Wednesday afternoon, I got a copy of a memo, and it's been widely circulated. It was intentionally leaked from the Bloomberg campaign. The memo is from two strategists to the top two managers of the campaign, Kevin Sheekey and Howard Wolfson, who is a holdover from the Clinton team. And it opens with this. As the race stands today, Sanders is poised to leave Super Tuesday with more than a 400-delegate lead against his next closest competitor, described as one Michael Bloomberg, a likely insurmountable advantage. Yes, they are sounding the alarm that Sanders has such a hefty lead in the polls, and the trends are in his favor, that Mike Bloomberg, who just bought his way onto the debate stage for the first time last night, and who is not engaged in the early primaries, has declared that he is the Messiah. He is the only one who can defeat Sanders and then go on, in his egomaniacal view, to beat Trump. But first, everybody else has to get out of Mike's way. And so this really set a tone that clearly enraged Elizabeth Warren, and it also drew a direct rebuke from Amy Klobuchar. And they have a right to be outraged that this rich guy who just entered the race, believing that money can buy him the presidency and defeat Donald Trump, replacing him, as Warren said, with another arrogant billionaire. So Mike Bloomberg believes he is entitled because he's got $62 billion. He's deployed somewhere north of $400 million, we're told so far. And everybody else is just supposed to look at the Money Express and get the hell out of the way. And that kind of arrogance, I think, plays right into the hands of Bernie Sanders. Because when you have a billionaire who fits the description of the, dark figures that Bernie has been tilting about ever since he started running for president in 2015, I believe that Bloomberg's arrogant and entitled behavior is going to lead to a lot of people saying, screw you, Bloomberg, I'm going for the socialist. Now, here's the final paragraph from this memo from the Bloomberg campaign. This is now a three-candidate race between Bloomberg, Sanders, and Trump. Both Sanders and Trump know that Bloomberg poses the greatest threat to their chances of winning this election. As we ascend and consolidate support, there will be blowback from both Sanders and Trump, both candidates themselves, but also their supporters who share some attributes. We expect them to escalate their attacks on Bloomberg, our campaign staff, and our supporters. Well, what has become clear is that while Bloomy entered the race saying that he's just about defeating Donald Trump, he'll put his fortune behind Democratic races for the Senate and the House, and that he will fund the campaign of the eventual nominee of the Democratic Party. Maybe he had his fingers crossed and he said, if it's me. Now, I believe I've seen one quote at least where Bloomberg says, yes, the offer extends to Sanders. But at this point, he's spending his money and deploying his media advantage to trying to squelch out Sanders. So he went to Salt Lake City today on the, it's not a rebound, he's trying to recover from his widely derided debate performance last night. And he used it to attend his stop in Utah to intensify attacks on Sanders. Quote, "If we choose a candidate who appeals to a small base like Senator Sanders, it will be a fatal error. We need Democrats and independents and Republicans to win." Referring to the suburban moderate voters who helped Democrats win back the House in 2018 with about $300 million of Bloomberg cash. He added, "That was the coalition that propelled Democrats to success in the midterms, and it's the coalition we need to win in November." Now, as I pointed out, many of the people recruited by Democrats, particularly to run for the House, were recent Republicans, just like Mike Bloomberg. Many of them are military and intelligence veterans who I think skew the Democratic Party away from its mission. So I believe this is going to backfire. This is the contrast that Bernie needs. For people who are squishy or squeamish about socialist, Democrat, democratic socialist, however you describe it, Bernie had a good comeback last night when they attempted to tag him with the socialism label. He talked about all the corporate socialism that supports the banks, the military-industrial complex. He still needs to refine that description to say that his version of democratic socialism is the necessary antidote to runaway capitalism. Apparently, nobody is sharing my campaign advice with the burn. And as Alan McLeod points out over at Mint Press News today, the effort to defeat Sanders is task one for Bloomberg. Quote, "In recent days, it's becoming increasingly unclear who Bloomberg sees as his primary enemy, Trump or Sanders. Today, his campaign called on the other moderate candidates to step down, as I just mentioned in the memo. And then he quotes from the Black Agenda report, Margaret Kimberly. Quote, "He is running to stop Sanders. It isn't clear to me if he wants to be the nominee or kingmaker for a neoliberal candidate. No one who is acceptable to Bloomberg looks strong, and so he has chosen to dispense with the middleman and run himself." Bloomberg has been training his guns, I'm quoting the article now, on the Vermont senator recently. He released the video condemning Bernie bros for their supposed intolerance, and Sheikey, the campaign manager, condemned Bernie's lies about Bloomberg's health. Now, Bernie didn't lie. His spokeswoman, Brianna Joy Gray, did walk back her statement that Bloomberg had suffered a heart attack. In fact, he had a diagnosis and they installed stents, but this occurred years ago, and apparently he did not technically have a heart attack. But on the debate stage last night, it's very interesting to see the pundits at the Washington Post clearly named Bernie Sanders as the winner, writing, "You wouldn't have thought from watching the debate that Sanders was the one threatening to open up a potentially insurmountable delegate lead in the weeks ahead. Instead, the candidates focused mostly on Bloomberg and arguably landed tougher attacks on each other than on Sanders." We'll get to it in a moment, but the New York Times declared Elizabeth Warren the winner of last night's debate. The Post named her second and said, "There was a time in this race when Warren clashed with Sanders, but last night she did him a massive favor by taking a chainsaw to Bloomberg." She jumped in early, throwing out some derogatory quotes about women. Bloomberg had called them fat broads and horse-faced lesbians, and her clever comment said those didn't come from Trump, they came from Mayor Bloomberg. And then she said, "We cannot substitute one arrogant billionaire for another." And then she went on to challenge him about the sexual harassment claims that were settled through non-disclosure agreements at the Bloomberg media empire. And she pushed him really hard to release those women from the non-disclosure agreements, saying that this is a liability going forward that Trump would exploit. Now, I have to say that the American people were losers in last night's debate because of the way Lester Holt and Chuck Todd and the NBC team conducted it. They were clearly looking for a primetime food fight. They didn't ask any questions about foreign policy, nothing about really Trump's fitness, his corruption. It was mentioned by candidates, but it wasn't the focus of questions. Basically, from the get-go, they said that, you can pretty much talk whenever you want, and Elizabeth Warren just jumped in. Bernie Sanders was given the first opportunity to respond to Bloomberg's comments that he's not electable. And that was quickly forgotten when Warren jumped in with her slashing attacks on Bloomberg. And the moderators just allowed people to run amok. There were times when 6 people were talking at once. And occasionally they would chum the waters of this little shark fight with a fresh gotcha question, like the one to Amy Klobuchar, how she forgot the name of Lopez Obrador, the president of Mexico. AMLO is the acronym I use for him, in an interview with Telemundo a week ago. And while I'm not the biggest fan of Amy Klobuchar, that is a trivial matter. And Pete Buttigieg decided to exploit that. We'll get to their exchanges in a bit. So one of the weird things that Bloomberg, and we don't know how many houses he has, we simply know he has $62 billion. But when Bernie Sanders said that there shouldn't be billionaires, that it's immoral, Bloomberg said, I can't think of a way that would make it easier for Trump to get reelected than listening to this conversation. It's ridiculous. We're not going to throw out capitalism. We tried that. Other countries tried. That was called communism, and it just didn't work. And then he went on to say that the leading socialist is a millionaire with 3 houses. Now, both are cheap shots. Bernie is in no way a communist, and certainly Trump will lie about that. He already has. But to see a so-called Democrat call a fellow so-called Democrat, Sanders, a communist, or suggest that he is, was a cheap shot. And as to Bernie's millions and his 3 houses, he's worth somewhere over $1 million and I think under $2 million. Most of that came from his savings. After all, he's been a government employee, a representative in Congress and then the Senate for a long time. And he's a pretty frugal guy. So he has I believe, a townhouse, a condo in Washington. He has a longtime family home in Burlington. And a couple of years ago, he bought a little cottage on Lake Champlain. And I can tell you because my grandfather came from Vermont. And our family had a cheap little cottage, we called it a camp, outside of Burlington on Mallett's Bay, Lake Champlain. And it wasn't because we were super wealthy, and neither were our neighbors. And so, to see a billionaire take a swipe downward at a mere millionaire who's worked all his life to get there, I think those are blows that actually hit back on Bloomberg and really don't penetrate the pretty thick skin of Bernie Sanders. So now to the New York Times pundits. They gave it to Elizabeth Warren, and they're all cheering for her, the comeback kid. But some of the critical comments are interesting. Being the underdog suits her, unclear whether it will help her. Ross Douthat, centrist Democrat, on the Times editorial page. She found the energy she'd lost in previous debates, positioned herself between the moderates and Sanders, and had her perfect foil in Bloomberg. Her work on him is probably more a Chris Christie knifing Marco Rubio scenario than a true campaign-reviving moment. Peter Wehner says she dropped a nuclear bomb on Mike. She won't win the nomination, but tonight she made sure that Bloomberg won't either. And I credit the Intercept writers for one of the best lines, that Elizabeth Warren murdered Mike Bloomberg politically, but it may end up being reported as a murder-suicide because it doesn't appear that she has the potential to come back, at least not between now and the end of voting on Super Tuesday. So I give her a lot of credit. But one of the problems is that she attacked everybody on stage, and so it kind of undermined her initial attacks on Bloomberg. And the other thing I'll reference is that I've said this before. After she attacked Bernie Sanders over the insignificant talking points that differentiated her supporters from Sanders supporters, they were used by volunteers door knocking. And then her claim that, boo-hoo, Bernie told her that a woman couldn't win in 2020, which he denies. Her polling numbers sharply dropped. You can see it right there in mid-January. Go to Real Clear Politics or any of the places that graph the polls. And so I don't know that this is going to help her. But just as Tulsi Gabbard took out Kamala Harris in one of the early debates last year, I do think that Warren did quite a number on Mike Bloomberg last night. Then when we turn to the Times comments on Bernie Sanders, Gil Duran, Sanders won because no one benefited more from the bloody dogpile on Bloomberg. Sanders gave as good as he got every time someone attacked him. Warren stole the show, but Sanders emerges unscathed and poised to maintain his momentum. Brett Stevens, the former editor of the Jerusalem Post and a Times commentator, his riff on socialism for the rich versus socialism for the poor was demagogic, but effective. And Maureen Dowd, the snarkiest member of the Times editorial writers page, this was his opponent's night to take him down, and they didn't. He stuck to his socialist guns even when Bloomberg suggested that his anti-capitalist creeds would help Trump. Curiously, he cited the favorite Democratic foil of 2016, the Russians, when asked to answer for the angry digital mob behind him. Senator Sanders, are you suggesting that some of your belligerent Bernie bros are bots? Well, it's interesting that she dismisses that. Because, as I've acknowledged, there are people who support Sanders who get into invective and name-calling, crude language, frequent use of the word bitch. But it's entirely possible that these are people who are posing as Bernie Sanders supporters, whether they're Russian or from, Pennsylvania. And that's what he tried to articulate last night to some effect. Now, I do think Sanders needs to have better answers about reports on his health. He needs to be more transparent about that, or at least posture that way. But overall, I think he did a great job last night and did come out on top. Now looking at some comments here from other reporters at the New York Times. Bloomberg's shakiest stretch came when Warren pressed him over his non-disclosure agreements, and she kind of paraphrased what he had said. I hope you heard what his defense was. I've been nice to some women. And we also see that Joe Biden is basically no longer getting much in the way of attack because his poll numbers have dropped by half. And he really is just a spectator now at these events. Somebody will tell him sooner or later, I'm sure. So I mentioned The Intercept had the great line about, here's the quote, Warren's strong performance may turn out to be a murder-suicide. It might be too late for Warren herself to recover in the race. In Nevada, 70,000 early votes have already been cast, compared to 86,000 total in 2016. But I do believe there's going to be big turnout on Saturday for the formal Nevada caucus. So I think that this is sizing up is a very interesting race. It is going to come down whether Klobuchar bails out because she runs out of money or because she submits to Mike Bloomberg's order. I doubt that will happen. They know that they do not have the room to grow fast enough to pick up enough delegates to challenge Bernie. And so it does become a Sanders-Bloomberg race. And I predict that the electorate will embrace Sanders and not the billionaire. And the attacks between Klobuchar and Buttigieg really were head-scratchers, because the fact that Klobuchar couldn't remember AMLO's name was exploited by Buttigieg to the point that she got offended and said, "Look, are you trying to say I'm dumb? Are you mocking me, Pete?" Then she turned to the camera and said, "He's basically saying I don't have the experience to be president. I passed over 100 bills as the lead Democrat since being in the U.S. Senate. I am the one, not you, who has won statewide and congressional district after congressional district." Now, that's not really a response to the question that was raised, but the animosity between those two has really grown, and I think they're just hurting each other in ways that can't change the big picture. And just to keep us in touch with the mentality of the Democratic National Committee and the pundits who act as gatekeepers, what is acceptable and what is not, Megan McArdle, who is a columnist for Bloomberg View, writing in the Washington Post today, says, "Hey, Democrats, you're attacking the wrong candidate." Now, she describes herself as a libertarian, and that's fine. But she is embracing the corporate media and Democratic leadership talking points, that Sanders is just too far left. And she uses this false, fuzzy math, claiming that because, he's only getting 25 or 30% of the vote so far, that the, moderate lane is so much bigger. That's just because there are more candidates. And as people drop out, those lanes, the progressive lane and the moderate lane, will basically merge. So she says the attacks on Bloomberg made for great theater, but boy, it's lousy politics. And then she basically says that he's a billionaire and that's why everybody should get out of their way. Everyone on that stage is a seasoned political professional who knows it all too well. So what did they think attacking Bloomberg would get them? Did they think they could scare off his donor? So she views this entirely as a money race. And then she begrudgingly concedes the winner of all this was, of course, the guy who's already winning, Sanders, who took only one serious blow from Bloomberg, who turned him near apoplectic by pointing out that he has 3 houses. I didn't see it that way, but that's her view. Buttigieg complained once again that Sanders is divisive. Buttigieg said that Bloomberg and Sanders represent the most polarizing candidates that the Democrats have. He used that line 2 or 3 times during the night. But, Pete, there is no excitement in the middle. People are not drawn to bland, vanilla candidates. And that's why people call you Mayo Pete. So the final line from McArdle here, if you think Sanders is the best candidate to run the country, well, swell. On the other hand, if you think that an iconoclastic socialist radical might make a bad president, not so good. And if a majority of Americans share that opinion, well, congratulations, nominee Sanders, and hello, President Trump. This kind of invective is so offensive. And it's not even intellectually honest. And this is the doggerel we are being fed as media consumers and voters in this critical election cycle. Every day when I remember, I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the PBC podcast with your subscriptions. Fine people like Suzanne Bowen, the incredible Faith Peoples, Benny Alto. They each kick in $10 or $20 a month, and you can do it too. All you have to do is visit peterbcollins.com, find the menu tab, click on it, choose Become a Subscriber, and you'll land on the sign-up page where it's easy for you to choose the level of support that's comfortable for you. And if you don't like PayPal, My mailing address is P.O. Box 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. So the suspense is now behind us. Judge Amy Berman Jackson in Washington today meted out a 40-month prison sentence for Roger Stone, the dirty trickster and longtime friend of Trump. And this has been the most incredible case of presidential interference in our judicial process that I have seen in my entire life. And I give the judge credit for deciding that 40 months was adequate. The original recommendation from the Justice Department based on their sentencing guidelines was as much as 9 years. And I think 3 years is enough to teach him a lesson. So I'm not going to second-guess the judge. But the pressure that she faced because of Trump, because the Justice Department changed its sentencing recommendation, and in the courtroom before sentencing, she peppered questions at John Crabb, Jr., the prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office, who was handed this pile of hot dog do and had to try to defend it. And he was asked, "Why are you standing here today?" And he said, "I apologize. I cannot engage in discussions of internal deliberations at the Justice Department." And in details from the Washington Post, we learn that Crabb repeatedly appeared to push the recommendation in the direction of the initial prosecutor's harsher one, arguing for enhancements that the more recent memo suggested were unnecessary. And that relates to the threats that were made by Roger Stone against Randy Credico, who took the Fifth Amendment rather than testify. And the judge approved an enhancement based on the obstruction of justice and the threatening of the witness. And despite that enhancement, and despite the weird dance done by John Crabb, she went ahead with the 3-year, 4-month sentence. Jackson asked Crabb at one point, "What is the government's position today?" And he basically just said nothing. And exasperated, she said, "Okay, fine." And then she said, "With respect to the second filing, the revised sentencing recommendation, you signed it. Did you write it?" Crabb: "I'm not at liberty to discuss the internal deliberations at Justice." Judge: "Were you directed to write it by someone else?" Crabb: "I can't answer." Now, I've never seen a case where you can defy a judge and refuse to answer a question in his or her courtroom. And at the very same time, well, it was actually a couple of hours earlier, Trump was tweeting, quote, "They say Roger Stone lied to Congress." He cites CNN. "Oh, I see. But so did Comey. And he also leaked classified information for which almost everyone other than crooked Hillary goes to jail for a long time. And so did Andy McCabe lie," Trump says. Well, this is whataboutism. Comey and McCabe and crooked Hillary were not before Judge Amy Berman Jackson today. They have not been tried or convicted by a jury. And Roger Stone has. But Trump tries to just rewrite the narrative and rewrite the rules for his own advantage. And a final quote from Judge Jackson, when she heard defense team's argument that Stone's lies didn't matter, quote, "The truth still exists. The truth still matters. Otherwise, everyone loses." Now, it's widely expected that the flurry of pardons issued by Trump this week are softening public opinion so that he can pardon Roger Stone before he has to spend even one night behind bars. And yesterday, coincidentally, in the preliminary hearings regarding the attempted extradition of Julian Assange from England to the United States, we learned that former Republican congressman and Orange County surfer Dana Rohrabacher visited the Embassy of Ecuador in London in August of 2017 and made an offer to Assange for a White House pardon in exchange for proof that the Russians had not been involved in the hacking of the DNC. Now, Rohrabacher has now confirmed that he made the offer, but he said that Trump had never approved it and he didn't discuss it with Trump in advance. And I tend to believe this. Deniability is something that a loyalist will always offer to his president. So Rohrabacher told Yahoo News that he had hoped to unearth evidence to back up the claim that the leaked DNC emails were sourced from Seth Rich. And Yahoo News, of course, like any other mainstream media outlet, tells us what we're supposed to think. Rich was murdered during a botched robbery attempt in 2016, but conspiracy theorists have since insisted that he was assassinated for exposing the DNC's handling of the 2016 primary. Although this has been shown to be an unsupported version of events, many Trump supporters still hold it as truth. Now, I don't hold it as truth. It is a possible explanation. And this case has never been closed. The claim that it's a botched robbery, unsupported because his watch, wallet, and phone were not taken. So that's media bullshit, clear and simple. Yesterday, the shadow chancellor of the United Kingdom paid a 2-hour visit to Julian Assange at the Belmarsh prison, and he came away comparing the attempt to extradite Assange to the Dreyfus case of our age. And that refers to Alfred Dreyfus, the 19th century Jewish French army officer who was tried and convicted on charges of treason amid a climate of anti-Semitism. And separate from the shadow chancellor, the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, Dunja Mijatovic, said Assange should not be extradited because of the potential impact on press freedom and concerns about the real risk of torture or inhuman or degrading treatment. Allowing the extradition would have a chilling effect on media freedom, could ultimately hamper the press in performing its task as a purveyor of information and public watchdog. The indictment raises important questions about the protection of those that publish classified information in the public interest, including those who expose human rights violations. Also, 2 members of the Australian Parliament, one appears to be a conservative who is a big supporter of Boris Johnson, they have both spoken up. They're saying that Johnson should block attempts to extradite Assange to the U.S. and return Julian to his homeland, Australia. George Christensen, a Liberal MP, I think that now is the time for the government that I'm a part of to be standing up and saying that the UK and the US, enough is enough. Leave the bloke alone and let him come home. Andrew Wilkie, an independent who joined, he's an independent MP in Australia, joined Christensen to hold a press conference. And he said, this will establish a precedent that if you're a journalist who does anything that offends any government in the world, you face the very real prospect of being extradited to that country. This is a political case, and what is at stake is not just the life of Julian Assange. It is about the future of journalism. And recently at the Gray Zone, they reported the obvious hypocrisy that the U.S. is demanding that Britain extradite Julian Assange while it refuses the extradition request of Britain to hand over Anne Sakoulas. Now, she is the American whose husband was assigned to a facility outside of London, and while driving her SUV, she ran over a British teenager and killed him. She was then spirited out of the country, and we now learn, because of reporting by Britain's Daily Mail, that Anne Sakoulas is or was a CIA officer along with her husband. Now it appears that Jonathan Sakoulas is active, and we don't know the status of his wife, Anne. But neither one of them is listed on the official diplomatic list that would give them diplomatic immunity. So this is an issue that the U.S. and Britain will continue to fight over. And I want to recommend Kevin Gostola's piece at Shadowproof today, where he details the filing made by Chelsea Manning's lawyers to attempt to win her release after almost a year in custody behind these bogus claims of contempt of court. And here's a statement from Chelsea. I cannot agree to participate in such a process, that would be the grand jury. No matter how much you punish me, I will remain confident in my decision. I have been separated from my loved ones, deprived of sunlight, could not even attend my mother's funeral. It is easier to endure these hardships now than to cooperate to win back some comfort and live the rest of my life knowing that I acted out of self-interest and not principle. Last week, in my in-depth interview with Nick Bryant, who wants to see the enablers of Jeffrey Epstein brought to justice, we talked about Les Wexner. He's the founder of Victoria's Secret and L Brands, The Limited, and he has stepped down. He is selling more than half interest in Victoria's Secret, and he is becoming chairman emeritus of his company. Now, I reference this because we still don't have answers as to why Les Wexner allowed Jeffrey Epstein to run his financial life. He gave him complete power of attorney for years. And I think Les Wexner owes us an explanation. And if you haven't already, please sign Nick Bryant's petition to demand investigations into the enablers of Jeffrey Epstein. And while we're on the sex predator file here today, the former Cardinal of Washington, D.C., Theodore McCarrick, secretly gave more than $1 million to a controversial group of Catholic missionaries and supported leniency for its founder after the Vatican punished him for sexual wrongdoing. So the white male cover-up of pedophile behavior in the Catholic Church extended to these financial crimes, where McCarrick was sending checks of as much as $50,000 from an account of money that had been donated by Catholics to continue the cover-up of sexual crimes. And now the Boy Scouts of America are facing the music. The national organization has filed for bankruptcy because of the growing number of sex abuse lawsuits and the liabilities that they represent. The bankruptcy filing only affects the national organization, and it's primarily to protect their $1 billion worth of real estate, campgrounds and stuff like that. Over at Who, What, Why, I recommend a couple of articles about election integrity under the byline of Gabriella Novello. She talks about how the appeals court in Atlanta has overturned the efforts by Florida Republican lawmakers to continue to block former felons, ex-cons, from voting. Now, just in 2018, voters overwhelmingly amended the Constitution to restore voting rights for more than 1 million former felons. And then the Republicans passed a law with a pretext to require former felons to pay any outstanding fines or fees before they could vote. And that's the equivalent of a poll tax, and it was struck down. I'm glad to see it. Novello also has a separate article about the risk of electronic voting machines, including in the state of Georgia. There's also a big controversy in Los Angeles County where they're using some new ballot marking machines that are considered quite vulnerable. And my friend Brad Friedman at bradblog.com can give you great coverage on that. At Vanderbilt University in Nashville last night, an odd couple was on stage. Obama's former national security advisor, Susan Rice, and Trump's former national security advisor, the wily, mustachioed John Bolton. And to her credit, Rice, who has her own problems and baggage, she took on John Bolton. I can't imagine withholding my testimony with or without a subpoena. I would feel like I was shamefully violating the oath I took to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And Bolton kind of ducked the question. I said I would testify if subpoenaed. My position is exactly the same as Joe Biden. Then Rice said, except Joe Biden didn't have firsthand knowledge about what transpired with Ukraine. And she notes that she was called to testify before the House Committee about Benghazi, and she did not require a subpoena. She went and testified. So finally today, Mick Mulvaney is the acting White House Chief of Staff. I think he also runs the Office of Management and Budget and maybe still the Consumer Protection Financial Bureau, or whatever those letters are. I think I inverted those. Anyway, he's in London. He gives a talk, and he blurts out an honest, truthiness remark. My party is very interested in deficits when there's a Democrat in the White House. The worst thing in the world when Barack Obama was president, deficits. Then Donald Trump became president, and we're a lot less interested as a party. Now, with our annual deficit exceeding $1 trillion, it's nice to see that there's at least one Republican in Washington who, while offshore, is willing to admit what they're doing and how hypocritical it is. What a wacky world we live in. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.